My name is Major Molly Martin, 35 years old. I just buried the only man who ever saw the real me beneath the uniform. Just 24 hours after the American flag was solemnly folded and handed to me, I stood at the threshold of my own home and witnessed a looting. My father-in-law Raymond was directing his sons to haul away my grandmother's armchair. His voice was cold as steel. Family legacy must be returned to the bloodline girl. Your mission here is over. My mother-in-law Patricia flashed me a smile as sweet as southern iced tea, yet dripping with pure venom. She picked up our wedding photo from the mantel, slid my picture out of the frame, and tossed it into the trash. "We'll keep the picture of Marcus," she said casually. "It doesn't need you fading into the background anymore anyway." They treated me like a guard whose shift had ended. But they made a fatal mistake. They thought they were fighting a lonely widow. They had no idea they were stepping straight into a minefield my husband had already rigged. Before I continue, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to see how this ends. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I needed the quiet. After a night on base, just breathing in the smell of pine cleaner and boot polish, trying to forget the heavy oak casket, I drove back to the house. My house. I slid the brass key into the front door deadbolt. It jammed. I tried again, pushing harder. The pins didn't click. They'd changed the locks. Barely a day in the ground, and they'd changed the damn locks. I pressed the doorbell. The door swung open. Timothy, my brother-in-law, stood there. He didn't offer a sympathetic nod. Didn't step aside. He scowled like I was selling magazines on his porch. "You're early." I pushed past him. The thick, suffocating Charleston humidity followed me inside, immediately clashing with the acrid stench of a cheap gas station cigar. Raymond stood dead center in the living room. My father-in-law. He held a clipboard, a pen clicking rhythmically in his hand, pacing like a general surveying a conquered outpost. Cardboard moving boxes were already stacked against the walls. "You're back sooner than expected," Raymond grunted. "No." "How are you holding up?" "No, I miss my son." Just a flat territorial bark. "We're conducting the handover." Handover, a military term, spoken in my living room as if this was an armory, not the home where his son had taken his last breath. Footsteps tapped lightly on the hardwood stairs. Patricia. She glided down, her pastel cardigan draped over her shoulders, holding my cherry wood jewelry box, the one Marcus bought me in Savannah. She popped the latch with a manicured thumb, peered inside. "These look terribly cheap, Molly," she purred. That trademark southern drawl, syrupy and smooth. "Standard issue, I assume you can take this box. We certainly have no use for it." She snapped it shut and shoved it onto the entryway table. Then she paused. Her eyes drifted to the hallway, to the shadow box on the wall. My bronze star. My campaign ribbons. The heavy polished metal I bled for in the dirt of Kandahar. She waved a dismissive hand. "Gerald, take those down. They completely ruin the aesthetic of the foyer." Gerald, sweating through his polo shirt, reached up to unhook my life's work. My jaw locked. The muscles in my neck pulled tight. "Don't touch them." My voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It was dead flat. The command tone. Raymond turned. He took a slow drag of his cigar, blowing the gray smoke across the room. He looked me up and down, not like a grieving daughter, like a squatter. "Listen to me, girl," he growled. "Marcus might have put a ring on your finger, but that piece of metal didn't turn you into a Coleman. Blood is blood. That doesn't change." He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "This estate was built on the sweat of our ancestors, old Charleston money. It belongs to this family. It's not falling into the hands of some transient soldier who could get deployed and killed tomorrow. An 8-year marriage, reduced to a bad investment. You have 2 hours," Raymond said, checking his gold watch. "Pack your personal clothes. Anything left after that is considered family property." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't throw a punch, even though every instinct drilled into my muscle memory screamed to neutralize the threat. Instead, I took a half step back. I let my shoulders drop an inch. I crossed my arms over my chest and leaned my spine against the wall. And I just looked at them. I watched Gerald struggling with the heavy shadow box. I watched Patricia dusting her hands off like she'd just handled garbage. I watched Raymond puffing his chest out drunk on his own perceived authority. They saw a broken widow pushed into a corner. They thought my silence was surrender. They didn't realize they were being processed. I was cataloging faces, logging behaviors, identifying weaknesses. My living room was a tactical grid, and they were targets painting themselves neon. My silence unnerved them. Timothy shifted his weight. Raymond stopped clicking his pen. Then I saw it. Gerald and Timothy grunted as they lifted my grandmother's floral armchair from the corner. The fabric was worn on the armrests, faded, completely out of place in this grand southern home. As they dragged it across the floor, the wooden legs scraped against the hardwood. A sharp, ugly sound. I stared at the faded fabric. My chest tightened, a cold ache spreading through my ribs. They weren't just erasing Marcus. They were erasing me. And this wasn't the first time. They had looked at me exactly like this, with the exact same disgust on the very first day I ever sat in that chair. The legs of my grandmother's armchair shrieked against the hardwood floor. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Gerald and Timothy dragged it toward the front door, leaving a faint scratch in the expensive finish of the Coleman family home. I watched the faded floral fabric disappear. They looked at the chair the exact same way they looked at me. Like trash. It took me straight back. 8 years ago. The first time I ever sat in that chair, though, back then it was pulled up to a massive polished mahogany dining table. My introductory dinner. I had bought a new dress. Dark blue, modest. I spent an hour ironing it in my barracks, making sure the creases were sharp enough to cut glass. I wanted to impress them. I really did. But the moment I sat down, the air went cold. The dining room smelled like roasted lamb and expensive red wine, but it felt like an interrogation room. Patricia sat at the opposite end of the table. She held her wine glass by the stem, her eyes scanning my posture, my hands, my clothes. "So, Molly," Patricia said, her voice dripping with that fake southern sweetness. "Marcus tells me you command a platoon of enlisted men. That sounds awfully loud." She said the word loud like it was a contagious disease. Raymond cut into his meat. The knife scraped the fine china. "Your father is from Ohio, correct? Works in a steel mill." "Yes, sir," I answered, keeping my back rigid. 30 years. Raymond chewed slowly. "Honest work, blue collar. It keeps the country running, I suppose." He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He didn't sound respectful. He sounded like a king discussing the dirt on a peasant's boots. For 2 hours, they didn't ask me about my favorite book. They didn't ask how Marcus and I met. They didn't ask what made me happy. They just picked apart my working-class roots and my military career like a mechanic looking for a rusted pipe. I should have known then. But I loved Marcus. 3 weeks before the wedding, Raymond summoned me. Not to the house, to his private country club. I walked onto the patio. Men in pastel polo shirts and khakis were drinking scotch and laughing. Raymond sat at a corner table, overlooking the 18th hole. He didn't stand up when I approached. He didn't offer me a seat. He just pushed a thick manila folder across the glass table. "Sit," he barked. I sat. I looked at the folder. "Prenuptial agreement," Raymond said, lighting a cigar. The smoke drifted into my face. "Standard procedure." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I don't care about Marcus's money, Mr. Coleman. I make my own living." Raymond let out a short, grating laugh. "Everyone says that, until the checks stop clearing." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes were dead and flat. "Your line of work is a liability, girl. Deployments, combat zones. We cannot have the Coleman estate tied up in probate because you catch a bullet in some desert. I am protecting my son's assets from your high-risk lifestyle." He wasn't protecting his son. He was insulating his money from a disposable soldier. I was just a bad investment to him. I signed it. I didn't even read the numbers. I just signed it, pushed it back, and walked away. Marcus found out. He saw the way his mother looked at my hands. He heard the venom in his father's voice. That night we sat on the floor of the tiny two-bedroom apartment we were renting near the base. The paint was peeling around the window frames. The radiator hissed. But it was safe. It was ours. Marcus sat with his back against the cheap drywall, his head in his hands. "They don't see you," he whispered. His voice was thick with shame. "They look right at you and they don't see you at all. They just see the uniform. And the zip code you grew up in." I sat next to him. I rested my head on his shoulder. "I don't need them to see me. I need you to see me." And he did. Marcus was the only civilian who never asked me to soften my edges. He loved the soldier. He loved the grit. He was my only ally in a house full of enemies. I tried one last time to bridge the gap. Our first Christmas as a married couple. I spent 4 weeks knitting a cashmere scarf for Patricia. My fingers were calloused from rifle drills and cold weather training, but I worked that soft yarn every night until my joints ached. I wanted to give her something real, something from my hands. I handed her the wrapped box on Christmas Eve. She untied the ribbon, lifted the lid, and pulled out the scarf. She held it with 2 fingers. "Oh," Patricia said. A tight, forced smile plastered across her face. "You made this how crafty. This will be absolutely perfect for Maria." Maria was their housekeeper. Patricia tossed my handmade scarf onto an armchair. Then, without missing a beat, she turned and handed Marcus a heavy velvet box. Inside was a solid gold Rolex. The message was deafening. Nothing I did would ever bridge the gap. My sweat, my blood, my heart, it was all worthless in their house. Have you ever bent over backward trying to please your in-laws only to get slapped in the face with their disrespect? Drop a yes in the comments if you know exactly how that feels. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to stand with me. I snapped back to the present. The living room was almost empty now. Raymond was still checking off his list. Patricia was directing the movers. They looked at me leaning against the wall, silent and still. They saw a woman who had given up, a shadow fading into the background. They forgot one crucial detail. They thought my silence was weakness. But any soldier will tell you the shadows are exactly where you sit when you are gathering intel on the enemy. 3 months before Marcus passed away. A cousin's wedding at a sprawling Charleston estate. Crystal chandeliers hung from ancient oak branches. Waiters in white cotton gloves carried silver trays of imported champagne. I wore a modest black dress. I bought it off a clearance rack in Ohio years ago. It felt like heavy body armor in a sea of custom-tailored silk. Patricia gripped my elbow. Her manicured nails painted a soft, innocent pink dug sharply into my skin. A physical threat disguised as maternal affection. She steered me toward a group of elderly women wearing heavy pearls and too much facial powder. "This is Molly," Patricia announced. Her voice was loud, much too loud. "Marcus's wife. She is a major in the army, you know." She did not say it with pride. She said it like a warning label, like I was a stray pit bull they allowed into the dining room. I smiled. I shook their soft, uncalloused hands. I kept my back perfectly straight. I was playing the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. But my mind was locked in a deep cover operational mode. I was operating behind enemy lines. The jazz band started a new song. The air inside the massive white tent grew thick with expensive perfume and body heat. I needed oxygen. I stepped away, slipping past the crowded open bar and walking out toward the back gardens. The Charleston night was heavy. Thick humidity stuck to my skin like a wet blanket. The overwhelming sweet scent of magnolia flowers hung thick in the air. I walked down a brick path looking for a quiet stone bench. Then I heard ice clinking in a crystal glass. I stopped moving. The sound came from behind a tall manicured hedge. A thick cloud of cheap cigar smoke drifted over the dark green leaves. "Raymond." I did not move a single muscle. I did not breathe. I pressed my spine against the cold brick wall of the estate. "We need to move fast," Raymond said. His voice was a low, gravelly growl. "The doctors gave him a few months. Once Marcus is gone, we execute the plan immediately." My chest went numb. They were not talking about making him comfortable. They were treating my husband's impending death like a corporate merger. Dad's lawyer said she has legal rights to stay in the house, Timothy said. His voice shook slightly, weak. He was always worrying about the legal blowback. What if she demands a massive payout? Let her try, Gerald scoffed. I could hear the ice hit his teeth as he took a drink. She is a soldier, she's used to moving around, living out of a canvas duffel bag. We just make the house incredibly unwelcoming. Cut off the utilities if we must. Change the locks while she is out at the military base. She will get the message and leave on her own. Gerald paused, letting out a short, greedy laugh. The veterinary clinic is the real prize. I already spoke with Dr. Henderson. He has liquid cash. He's willing to buy the practice the moment the estate goes into probate. He wants the building and the client list. We can clear $1 million easy. My stomach turned violent. Marcus was still breathing. He was sitting 50 yards away in a folding chair, drinking water, fighting a war in his own body. And his own brother was already selling off his life's work. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Soft, deliberate steps. You boys are overthinking this entire operation, Patricia said. She had left the champagne fountain to join the war council. Why are you so worried about a woman who came into this family with empty pockets? Patricia laughed, a cold, dry, metallic sound. She brought absolutely nothing to the table. She will leave with absolutely nothing. Leave Molly to me. Woman to woman, I know exactly what to say to break her spirit. I stood frozen in the dark shadows. The sweet smell of the magnolias suddenly made me want to vomit. This was not a simple family dispute over inheritances. This was a calculated, cold-blooded tactical strike. They were actively planning to pick his carcass clean before his body even went cold. I did not confront them. A smart soldier does not engage multiple hostile targets without a weapon. I walked back to the tent, found Marcus, and told him my head was pounding. The drive home was suffocating. The yellow streetlights flashed across the windshield, illuminating the dark interior of our truck. Marcus kept his eyes focused on the empty asphalt. I looked at him. I did not cry. Crying was a civilian luxury I could not afford right now. I leaned my head back against the headrest and delivered my intelligence report. Flat, precise, stripped of all weakness. Objective: seize all assets, including the house and the clinic, I said, staring straight ahead into the night. Method: psychological pressure. Create a hostile living environment. Target: timeline immediately after you are gone. Marcus did not say a word. He did not ask if I was sure about what I heard. He did not try to defend his blood. I watched his hands. He gripped the leather steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white. The tendons in his forearms stood out like thick steel cables. His jaw locked tightly. He pulled the truck into our driveway and slammed the gear shift into park. The engine ticked loudly in the quiet night. Marcus turned his head slowly. He looked at me. The soft, gentle eyes of the animal doctor I married were completely gone. His gaze was sharp, lethal, dangerous. The heavy shadows in the truck cast harsh, deep lines across his face. "All right," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a hunting knife. "They have declared war." He unbuckled his seatbelt, the metal clicking loudly. "Now it is time to draft a counter-offensive." The tires crunched over the dead leaves on the driveway. I killed the engine. The silence inside the truck cab was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. We walked through the front door. I locked the deadbolt. A heavy metallic click echoed down the dark hallway. Marcus did not walk toward the bedroom to rest. He walked straight into our narrow kitchen. He flipped the wall switch. The harsh fluorescent light hummed to life, a cheap electrical buzz that vibrated in my teeth. He dragged a metal step stool to the pantry. He reached over the top shelf, shoving aside dusty boxes of dry pasta and dented soup cans. He pulled down a black leather briefcase. I stood by the counter, crossing my arms. I had never seen that briefcase in my life. Marcus was an animal doctor. He carried canvas duffel bags, bags that smelled of rubbing alcohol, wet dog hair, and cheap antibiotic ointment. He did not carry executive leather briefcases with combination locks. He dropped it onto the Formica table. The heavy brass lock snapped open, a sharp, violent sound that made me flinch. "They think I am soft," Marcus said. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat down. His voice was cold. It did not shake. It held no fear. My father, my mother, my brothers, they have always thought I am weak because I cured dogs instead of suing people. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I do not fight the way they do, Molly. I do not yell. I do not throw cheap insults across a country club patio. He looked up at me. His eyes were dark and focused. I diagnose the disease, and I write the treatment plan. He spread the papers out across the table. 8 years ago, when my father shoved that prenuptial agreement in your face, I knew. I knew exactly what they were. I knew a war was coming. I did not hire a family attorney. I hired Charles Peaton. I knew that name. Everyone in Charleston knew that name. Charles Peaton was a real estate and probate shark. He wore custom suits and drove luxury cars. He destroyed people in court. Men in the legal district called him the cleaner. Defense line 1, Marcus said. He slapped a thick folder onto the table. It had a heavy red notary stamp on the front. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I looked down at the legal jargon printed in sharp black ink. Every major asset, Marcus continued. This house, the veterinary clinic on King Street, the investment accounts. All of it was transferred into this specific legal status years ago. It acts like a legal landmine. The exact second my heart stops beating, sole ownership transfers directly to you. It bypasses probate court entirely. It bypasses their high-priced lawyers. It is bulletproof. He did not wait for me to speak. He slapped a second folder down next to the first. Defense line 2, the ironclad will. He tapped his index finger against a thick paragraph at the bottom of the page. This document leaves every remaining cent to you. It has been notarized. It has 3 independent witnesses. But Charles added a specific trap, a no contest clause. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. If my father, my mother, or my brothers try to challenge this, will in any court of law they automatically forfeit any right to anything. Not a single dollar, not even a family photo from the attic. If they step on the wire, the whole thing detonates in their faces. My throat felt like it was closing. I stared at the man sitting across the cheap Formica table. He was dying. His skin was pale. His body was failing him day by day. But his mind was building a concrete fortress around me. He was standing directly between me and the incoming artillery fire. Then he reached into the very bottom of the briefcase. He pulled out a single sealed envelope. There was no legal letterhead on it. Just my name, written in his familiar sloppy handwriting. The nuclear option, Marcus whispered. He slid the envelope across the table. It stopped inches from my hands. This is not a love letter, Molly. This is an indictment. I reached out and let my fingertips rest on the rough paper. I wrote down everything, Marcus said. His voice grew harder, scraping against his dry throat. Every insult, every time my mother called your life a temporary phase. Every time my father talked about protecting the bloodline from an outsider. I documented the cashmere scarf you knitted. I documented the cheap remarks at the dinner table. It is all in there. He took a ragged breath. The last line of this letter states clearly that by treating my soldier like an enemy, they have stripped themselves of the right to be called my family. The refrigerator kicked on, a low vibrating rumble in the quiet room. I looked at the papers covering the table, a 3-layer defense perimeter. Built over 8 long years. Built in complete silence while they treated him like a fool. Charles Peaton holds the original copies, Marcus said. He reached across the table and grabbed my hand. His grip was physically weak, but his intention was solid rock. He has direct, unchangeable orders. If my family shows any hostility toward you, he deploys everything. Marcus swallowed hard. The cancer was already taking up too much space inside his body. He looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with a fierce, protective light. I am sorry I am leaving you in the middle of a war zone, Major, he said softly. But I know you will not retreat. He held my gaze. He did not ask for pity. He asked for a promise. Promise me, you hold the line. I did not see a sick husband. I did not see a victim. I saw a commanding officer handing me the most important operational objective of my life. I pulled my shoulders back. I squared my posture. I locked my eyes onto his. Understood, sir. 6 weeks after Marcus opened that leather briefcase on our kitchen table, the real war began. The doctor's office smelled like industrial bleach and stale coffee. The oncologist sat across from us, folding his hands over a thick manila folder. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He used a lot of soft, sympathetic words, medical cushioning to soften a fatal blow. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't ask the universe why he was dying at 38. He just stared at the sterile white wall, took one long, ragged breath, and turned his head to look at me. Call Charles. That was his entire response. He treated his own death sentence like a failing engine. You don't cry over a blown gasket, you grab a wrench. The next few weeks were a brutal, ugly slide. The chemotherapy stripped him down to bone and pale skin. He threw up until his throat bled. But through the haze of the morphine and the endless rhythmic beeping of the IV pump, his mind was a steel trap. Charles Piton came to the hospital room late at night. The two of them whispered over legal pads while I slept in the plastic chair in the corner. They locked the no contest clause into the will. It was the perfect ambush. Anyone who challenged the paper lost their right to a single dime. Then the vultures started circling. The Colemans came to the house more in the last month than they had in 8 years. They smelled blood in the water. They didn't come to wipe a damp cloth over Marcus's forehead. They came to appraise the real estate. I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of ice water, watching Raymond. He wasn't looking at his son. He was walking around the living room, knocking his heavy knuckles against the drywall near the staircase. Thump. Thump. Solid. Raymond grunted, talking to himself. He ran a hand over the mahogany banister. Bones of this house are still good. Needs a new coat of paint on the trim, though. Upstairs in the bedroom, Patricia played her part. She brought a cheap plastic Tupperware container of cold chicken soup. She set it on the nightstand next to the morphine bottles, then pulled a glossy Pottery Barn catalog from her designer leather tote. She sat in the armchair, crossing her legs. She flipped the thick, glossy pages, not even looking at the bed where Marcus lay sweating through his sheets. "Molly, dear." Patricia said, her voice a sickly sweet drawl. She traced her manicured finger over a picture of a wooden crib. "Have you put any thought into requesting a transfer back to Fort Bragg? I imagine living near an active military base will be much easier for your career once things conclude here." She was measuring the room for a nursery, right in front of a dying man. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin nearly broke. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. I wanted to drag her out of the house by her pastel cardigan. But I held my ground. I maintained my bearing. I let her flip her pages. A few days later, the real agenda spilled out. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The house was dead quiet. I was leaning over the bed, adjusting the plastic IV tubing taped to Marcus's bruised arm. The hardwood floorboards creaked in the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Gerald and Timothy. They thought Marcus was heavily sedated. They thought I was downstairs in the laundry room. "Dad says we swap the deadbolts the afternoon of the funeral," Gerald muttered. His voice was hushed, but the greed in it was loud. "Fast and clean." Timothy sighed. He always sounded like a coward, afraid of getting caught. "Is that legal? What if she puts up a fight?" "She's military," Gerald scoffed. "She'll be tied up with VA casualty assistance and life insurance paperwork all day. By the time she drives back here, her bags will be sitting on the front porch. She has no money for a high-end lawyer. We lock her out. We starve her out." I froze. My hand stopped moving over the plastic tube. A cold, skeletal hand suddenly clamped around my wrist. Marcus. His eyes were sunken, dark purple circles bruised deep into his pale skin. But the look in his eyes wasn't sick. It was pure hellfire. He had heard every single word through the cracked bedroom door. He squeezed my wrist. His physical grip was weak, but the raw, violent anger behind it was absolute. "You see," Marcus rasped. His voice was a dry, hollow rattle in his chest. "Never underestimate their greed. Now you know exactly what to do." He died 3 days later. The graveyard was a swamp. Thick, suffocating Charleston heat baked the turned dirt. The air smelled of wet grass and wilting funeral flowers. I stood at the edge of the open grave in my Army service uniform. The stiff collar dug into my sweating neck. I kept my spine rigid. I watched the polished oak casket go down into the dark earth. The second the preacher closed his leather Bible, the shift happened. Raymond stepped away from the grave. He waved a hand gathering Patricia, Gerald, and Timothy. He deliberately positioned his broad shoulder to block me out of the circle. He treated me like a stranger who had wandered into a private country club event. I stepped forward anyway. The brass buttons on my jacket caught the heavy afternoon sun. "To preserve Marcus's legacy," Raymond announced. His voice carried an obnoxious artificial weight. He wasn't grieving. He was giving a speech to his heirs. "The King Street house will be transferred to Gerald. His boy needs a stable place to grow up. Marcus would want the property to serve the future of this family." He was carving up the meat before the dirt even hit the lid of the coffin. "I am his family," I said. My voice was low. It held no tears. It cut right through the humid, suffocating air like a straight razor. Raymond stopped. He turned his head slowly. He looked at my brass medals. He looked at my face. He didn't see a grieving widow holding onto the last shreds of her life. He saw a nuisance, a squatter, an insect on his windshield. "You aren't blood, Molly," Raymond said, his voice dropping to a vicious, icy whisper. "And down here, blood is the only thing that matters." I did not turn into my driveway. I killed the engine half a block down the street. The air conditioner in my truck died, letting the suffocating Charleston heat bleed through the glass. A massive white commercial moving truck was parked on my front lawn. Its heavy diesel engine idled, spitting dark exhaust into the humid air. The rear metal door was rolled up. I watched through my dirty windshield. Gerald was standing on my porch. He was sweating through a pink polo shirt, pointing his finger at 2 day laborers. They were hauling my oak dining chairs down the wooden steps. They were moving fast, stripping the meat off the bone. I did not panic. I did not hit the steering wheel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a private number. "Charles," I said. My voice was completely flat. "It is Molly." "Go ahead," Charles answered. His voice was sharp, professional. No wasted words. "The targets are on site. The looting is in progress." "Understood, Major," Charles said. "Backup is en route. Estimated time of arrival is 10 minutes. Hold your position." The line went dead. I put the phone away. I opened my door. The rusted hinges groaned. I walked down the sidewalk. My boots struck the concrete in a steady, measured rhythm. I did not rush. I walked up the driveway and stopped dead center at the base of the metal moving ramp. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest. I lifted my chin. I locked my eyes straight ahead. I did not say a single word. The 2 day laborers came down the porch steps carrying a heavy dresser. They saw me standing at the bottom of the ramp. They stopped. They were rough men used to hard labor, but they recognized a blockade when they saw one. My silence was a concrete wall. Gerald noticed the delay. He stomped to the edge of the porch, his face red and slick with sweat. "What are you doing?" Gerald barked. "Get out of the way. You are blocking the ramp." I did not blink. I stared right through his eyes to the back of his skull. Gerald wiped his forehead. His arrogant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. He turned toward the open front door. "Dad." "She is back." Raymond stepped out onto the porch. He held his cheap cigar between his teeth. He looked down at me from the top step. He looked annoyed, like he was swatting a mosquito. "I gave you an order, girl," Raymond growled. Smoke leaked out of the corner of his mouth. "You had 2 hours. You blew it. Now get off my property before I have these men physically remove you." I did not move a single muscle. I just watched the ash fall from his cigar onto his expensive leather loafers. Rumble. A low, heavy engine sound vibrated against the pavement. It was not a dirty commercial truck. It was the smooth, purring growl of a twin-turbo V8. A black BMW 7 Series glided up the street. The paint was polished to a mirror finish. The dark-tinted windows rolled up tight. It turned sharply into the driveway tires, crunching over the loose gravel. It did not park politely on the street. It pulled up directly behind the moving truck, violently boxing it in. The heavy car door swung open. Charles Peaton stepped out onto the concrete. He was a tall man, broad shoulders. He wore a charcoal gray custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than Gerald's entire vehicle. His black leather shoes clicked sharply against the driveway. He carried a heavy alligator skin briefcase in his right hand. He did not look at the moving guys. He did not look at Gerald. He walked past me, giving me a single respectful nod. Then he stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs, looking up at Raymond. "Are you Raymond Coleman?" Charles asked. His voice boomed. It was a voice built for destroying people in federal courtrooms. It echoed off the brick walls of the house. Raymond pulled the cigar from his mouth. His eyes darted to the BMW, then to the expensive suit. His arrogant posture cracked. "Who wants to know?" "I am Charles Peaton," he said. He did not offer his hand. "I am the legal counsel representing the estate of the late Marcus Coleman, and I am the retained attorney for my client, Major Molly Martin." Charles hit the word major like it was a physical weapon. He said it with absolute respect, a respect Raymond had never shown me in 8 years. Gerald swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. Charles stepped 1 foot onto the bottom stair, invading their space. His eyes were dead and cold. "I am officially notifying you that you are currently committing criminal trespassing." Charles said his words sharp as broken glass. "You are also in the active process of committing grand theft of property belonging solely to my client." Raymond puffed his chest out, trying to recover his false authority. "This is family business. You have no jurisdiction here." Charles let out a short, terrifying laugh. "When you attempt to steal assets worth over $500,000, Mr. Coleman, it is no longer family business. It is a felony." Charles pointed a long finger at the moving truck. "I demand you cease all operations immediately. I demand you command these men to carry every single piece of furniture back exactly where they found it. If you do not comply in the next 30 seconds, I will make a personal phone call to the Charleston County Sheriff. We play golf every Sunday. He will have 3 squad cars here in 5 minutes, and you will all spend the night sleeping on a concrete floor in the county jail." Silence fell over the driveway. Heavy, suffocating silence. Raymond's face turned the color of old ash. The cigar trembled slightly in his fingers. Gerald took a slow step backward, hiding behind his father. Timothy, standing in the doorway, looked like he was about to be sick. They finally realized the truth. They were not fighting a grieving, isolated widow anymore. They were staring down the barrel of the law. The real war had just started. Have you ever watched an arrogant bully finally realize they picked the wrong person to mess with? It is the best feeling in the world. Drop a yes in the comments if you love seeing instant karma. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next. Charles did not wait for Raymond to speak. He turned the handle of his briefcase. A sharp, loud click echoed across the porch. "Now!" Charles set his eyes locking onto Raymond. "Let us go inside and look at the paperwork." Charles Peaton did not wait for an invitation. He walked past Raymond, past the sweating day laborers, and stepped straight into my house. His black leather shoes clicked against the hardwood. He walked directly into the dining room. I followed him inside, stopping at the threshold. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe. I crossed my arms. I was the sentry at the gate. Charles was the heavy artillery. The dining room held the same heavy mahogany table where Patricia had mocked my blue-collar roots 8 years ago. Now it was Charles's courtroom. He set his alligator skin briefcase flat on the polished wood. Snap. Snap. 2 sharp metallic clicks echoed off the bare walls. He popped the lid open. Raymond stormed into the room, his face a dark, dangerous shade of red. Gerald and Timothy followed, hovering behind him like nervous bodyguards. Patricia stood near the kitchen, her hands clutching her pearl necklace. "You have absolutely no right to be in this house," Raymond growled, pointing a thick cigar-stained finger at Charles. "This is a private, internal family matter." Charles did not look up immediately. He slowly pulled a thick stack of papers from the briefcase. Then he raised his head. A cold surgical smile cut across his face. "Mr. Coleman." Charles said, his voice smooth but lined with razor wire. When a $500,000 property is actively being stripped of its contents, it ceases to be a family matter. It becomes a matter of law. Charles separated the top document and pushed it across the table. It stopped inches from Raymond's hands. "Let us start with basic property rights," Charles said. "These are the official deeds, the title for this primary residence, the commercial deed for the veterinary clinic on King Street, the deed for the vacant riverfront lot." Raymond stared at the papers. He did not pick them up. "If you look closely at the highlighted sections," Charles continued, his tone clinical and merciless, "you will see that every single one of these assets was legally restructured 5 years ago. They are registered under joint tenancy with right of survivorship." Timothy blinked, confused. Gerald shifted his weight. Raymond's jaw tightened. "For those of you who did not attend law school," Charles said, "that means these properties bypass probate court entirely." The exact second Marcus Coleman's heart stopped beating, Major Martin became the sole uncontested legal owner of every brick, every nail, and every blade of grass. "Your presence here today is an act of criminal trespassing." "That is impossible," Gerald snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "Marcus would have told us." Charles ignored him. He pulled a second document from the briefcase, a thick packet bound with a blue legal cover. It carried a heavy raised notary seal. "Just to ensure there's no confusion," Charles said, slapping it down on the table, "this is Marcus's final executed will and testament. It leaves the entirety of his remaining liquid assets, personal property, and investment accounts to his wife. It is fully notarized. It is backed by 3 independent sworn witnesses." Patricia stepped forward. Her pristine, fake sweet facade was crumbling fast. Her hands shook. "No. No, Marcus would never do that. He respected his bloodline. He wouldn't shut us out. You forced him to sign that." She pointed a shaking finger at me. I did not react. I just watched her panic. Charles turned his head slowly. He looked at Patricia like she was a bug on a windshield. "Ma'am, not only did your son willingly sign this document, he specifically anticipated this exact reaction from all of you." Charles flipped to the 3rd page of the will. He tapped a specific paragraph with a gold-plated pen. "Marcus instructed me to include an ironclad no contest clause," Charles said. The room went completely dead. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to stop. "Let me translate that for you. If any person in this room attempts to challenge the validity of this will in civil court, they automatically forfeit their right to inherit anything. Not a single dollar, not a piece of furniture, not even a childhood photograph from the attic." Charles leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the table. He locked eyes with Raymond. "Your son dug a trench, lined it with legal explosives, and waited. And today, you all marched right into it." Raymond's red face drained. He turned a sickly pale gray. The cigar fell from his hand, bouncing softly onto the hardwood floor, sending a shower of gray ash over his expensive loafers. He didn't even notice. Gerald looked like he was going to throw up. Timothy backed away, bumping into the wall. They were stripped, exposed. The legal beating was absolute and final. I stood in the doorway, my breathing steady. The air in the house suddenly felt lighter. The oppressive, toxic weight of the Coleman family was evaporating under the harsh fluorescent light of the law. Charles stood up straight. He buttoned the center button of his suit jacket. He looked at the 4 pale, terrified faces staring back at him. Then he looked over at me. He gave me a single, respectful nod. Mission accomplished. But Charles wasn't finished. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out another legal brief. He pulled out a standard white paper envelope. "Marcus knew that the law was not enough," Charles said. The aggressive courtroom edge left his voice. It became quiet, heavy. He knew he needed to leave something stronger than a contract, something for your conscience. Charles held the envelope up. "If any of you still doubt your son's intentions, maybe you should hear the last words he actually wanted to say to you." Charles Peaton reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses and slid them onto his face. The movement was slow, deliberate. He slid his thumb under the flap of the plain white envelope and tore it open. The sound of ripping paper was deafening in the quiet dining room. He pulled out 2 sheets of lined yellow legal paper. The handwriting was messy, written by a man whose body was already shutting down. Charles cleared his throat. He did not look at any of them. He looked only at the paper. To my family. Charles began, his voice dropping into a heavy formal cadence. A judge reading a final verdict. If you are hearing these words, it means I am no longer there to stand between my soldier and your cruelty. Stop, Raymond barked. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. This is private. You have no right to read a private letter in front of strangers. Charles slowly lowered the yellow paper. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Raymond. His expression was completely blank. My client instructed me to read this letter publicly if you displayed any hostile action toward his wife. Charles said, his tone flat and unyielding. You have done exactly that. I will finish reading. Charles raised the paper again. For 8 years, you have looked at Molly and seen nothing but a uniform. You treated her sacrifice as a defect. You treated her courage as an inconvenience. I watched Patricia. Her hands were clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. Her perfect pastel cardigan facade was cracking piece by piece. Dad! Charles read the word, hitting the air like a hammer striking an anvil. You demanded she sign a prenuptial agreement because you do not believe in loyalty. You only believe in bloodlines. You looked at my wife and saw a financial liability. Raymond flinched. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but he could not say a word. The law had already gagged him. Now his dead son was stripping him bare. Charles did not pause. He turned his eyes to the paper, delivering the next strike. Mom, you took the cashmere scarf she spent weeks knitting for you, and you handed it off to the housekeeper. You did it right in front of her. Because in your eyes, her effort has no value. Her blue-collar blood makes her invisible to you. Patricia let out a sharp, choked gasp. Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over her carefully powdered cheeks. But they were not tears of regret. I knew the difference. They were tears of pure humiliation. The ugly, rotten core of her southern hospitality had just been dragged out into the harsh, fluorescent light. Charles kept reading, his voice steady, driving the nails deeper into the coffin. Gerald, Timothy, you two talked behind her back for years. You treated her like a temporary squatter. You sat at family dinners and planned how to carve up my clinic the second I was in the ground. Gerald looked away, staring hard at the baseboards. Timothy crossed his arms, trying to make himself look smaller. They were cowards, exposed cowards. Then Charles paused. He took a breath. When he spoke again, the hard, aggressive edge left his voice. It became warmer. He was no longer reading a list of crimes. He was reading a testament. You never understood, Charles read softly. I loved Molly exactly because she is a soldier. She taught me about honor, about loyalty, about standing up for what is right, even when you have to do it completely alone. She was my moral compass. A hot tear broke loose and slid down my cheek. I did not wipe it away. I kept my chin high, my shoulders pulled back. I stood in the doorway and let it fall. It was not a tear of grief. It was pure, unadulterated pride. This house is not just wood and drywall. Charles read, his voice gaining strength again. It is the fortress we built together, and a soldier never abandons her post. Charles flipped to the second yellow page. He adjusted his glasses. He looked up, sweeping his gaze across the 4 Colemans standing in my dining room. Then he looked back down to deliver the final blow. So listen closely. Everything I have belongs to her. It is not a gift. It is an acknowledgement of her worth. By attacking her when she was at her weakest, you proved you deserve absolutely nothing from me. My true legacy is not a piece of real estate or a bank account. My legacy is the love I have for this woman. Charles let the paper drop slightly. He read the final sentence. Slow, cold, absolute. Get out of her house. Charles took off his glasses. He folded the yellow papers and slid them back into the white envelope. He slipped the envelope into his inside jacket pocket. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dead heavy. The air conditioning kicked on, blowing a cold draft through the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Patricia stood, frozen mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Gerald and Timothy looked at the floor, totally defeated. Raymond stared blankly at the mahogany table. The arrogant patriarch, the man who believed his bloodline made him invincible, looked incredibly old. He looked small. His knees buckled. He fell backward, hitting the seat of one of the dining chairs with a heavy thud. He sat there staring at the wall, completely destroyed. Charles Peaton did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on his leather briefcase. The air in the dining room tasted like stale sweat and fear. "I suggest you get to work," Charles said to Gerald and Timothy. "The hourly rate for those day laborers outside is ticking, and you are paying them out of your own pockets." The two arrogant heirs, the men who had spent their entire lives living off their father's bank accounts, broke. They did not argue. They walked out the front door, shoulders slumped, looking like beaten dogs. For the next 45 minutes, I watched them work. Gerald and Timothy, sweating profusely in their expensive polo shirts, hauled my dining chairs back inside. They carried the heavy oak dresser up the stairs. Their breathing was ragged. Their faces were flushed dark red. Raymond did not help them. He sat motionless in the dining chair, staring blankly at the mahogany table. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. The patriarch was dead. Finally, Gerald and Timothy dragged my grandmother's faded floral armchair back into the living room. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, but this time the sound did not hurt. It sounded like justice. They dropped the chair in its exact original spot. Patricia took a hesitant step toward me. Her mascara was smeared dried in dark, ugly cracks across her cheeks. The fake Southern charm was completely gone. She looked desperate. "Molly," Patricia whispered, her voice shaking. She reached her hand out. "Molly, maybe we can." I raised my right hand, palm facing out, a hard, solid stop. "There is no we, Mrs. Coleman," I said. My voice was quiet, but it hit her like a physical blow. "There never was." Patricia's hand dropped. She looked at me, realizing for the very first time that the door was permanently closed. She turned, grabbed her designer purse from the entryway table, and walked out of my house. Raymond followed, shuffling his feet like an old broken man. Gerald and Timothy did not even look at me. The heavy front door closed behind them. The fallout in Charleston was brutal, and it was fast. Old money society thrives on gossip. The story leaked within 48 hours. Word spread through the country clubs and the high-end charity galas. The Coleman family had tried to rob a widowed Army major on the day of her husband's funeral, and they got caught in a legal bear trap. Raymond canceled his golf memberships. He stopped showing his face at the clubhouse. Men he had drank scotch with for 30 years suddenly stopped returning his phone calls. Patricia was quietly removed from the board of directors of 3 separate charity organizations. No one wanted their fundraising events associated with a woman who stole from her dying son. Gerald's plan to sell the veterinary clinic imploded. Dr. Henderson, the man waiting with liquid cash, pulled out of the deal the second he heard the rumors. Nobody in town wanted to do business with a coward. They did not just lose the real estate. They lost the only thing they actually cared about, their reputation. They were pariahs in their own city. A week later, the mail carrier dropped a heavy cream-colored envelope into my mailbox. I recognized the thick, expensive cardstock. The Coleman family crest was embossed on the back. I carried it into the kitchen and tore it open. Inside was a handwritten note from Raymond. It was a pathetic, carefully worded apology. He talked about grief making people do irrational things. He talked about honoring Marcus. It was garbage. Tucked behind the letter was a cashier's check. $50,000. It was a bribe. A final desperate attempt to buy my silence, or maybe to buy back a shred of his own conscience. He thought he could write a check and wipe the slate clean. He still thought money could fix the rot in his soul. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp paper. I did not feel angry. I just felt tired. I carried the check to the stainless steel kitchen sink. I pulled a cheap plastic lighter from the junk drawer. I flicked the metal wheel. The small flame hissed. I held the corner of the check to the fire. The paper curled, turning black, then glowing bright orange. I held it over the drain until the heat burned my fingertips. I dropped the burning remains into the metal basin. I turned on the cold water faucet. The water hit the black ashes, washing them down the dark drain in a swirl of gray sludge. I did not need their money. I did not need their fake apologies. I did not need their acceptance. I dried my hands on a dish towel. I took a plain white envelope from the counter. I scooped the remaining wet black ash from the sink and dropped it inside. I sealed the envelope, wrote Raymond's address on the front, and slapped a stamp on it. No letter, no return address, just the ashes. That night, I turned off the harsh kitchen lights. I walked into the living room and sat down in my grandmother's faded floral armchair. The house was completely silent. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a war zone. It was the deep, steady quiet of a secured perimeter. I did not feel a rush of euphoric victory. I just felt a profound, heavy relief. I fought this war to protect my home, not to destroy theirs. The mission was over. I looked at the coffee table. Marcus's handwritten letter, the yellow legal paper, rested next to my coffee mug. He gave me the weapons. He gave me the intelligence. But I held the line. I survived the ambush. 6 months. That is how long it took for the dust to completely settle. The brick building on King Street did not go to Dr. Henderson. It did not get gutted, sterilized, and flipped for a quick commercial real estate profit by greedy heirs. I stood in the clinic's front reception area. The smell of wet dog fur, rubbing alcohol, and industrial floor cleaner hit my nose. It was a heavy, honest smell. Real work. Above the heavy glass front door, a brand new brushed steel sign hung bolted against the exposed red brick, the Marcus Coleman Memorial Veterinary Clinic. I kept my commission in the Army. I still wore the uniform, Monday through Friday, running logistics and personnel out of the base. But on the weekends, I was here. Charles Piton filed the nonprofit foundation paperwork for me back in late October. It was a massive, frustrating headache of federal tax codes, city zoning permits, and endless board meetings. But Charles pushed it through the local courts like a diesel bulldozer. No one dared block his filings. The waiting room was packed. A retired Marine with a carbon fiber prosthetic leg sat in a cheap plastic chair, scratching behind the ears of a massive, drooling German shepherd. A young Army spouse, exhausted with dark bags under her eyes, wrangled 2 screaming toddlers and a hyperactive golden retriever puppy. This place was not just a medical facility anymore. It was a safe house, a designated rally point, a secure location where military families and combat vets could bring their animals for free medical care. No massive credit card bills, no insurance claims, just immediate help. I walked down the narrow hallway into the back break room. 3 young veterinary graduates stood near the coffee machine, wearing crisp green scrubs. They looked incredibly nervous. Fresh out of school, carrying massive student debt, ready to start their residency program through our new foundation. I poured a cup of black coffee. I leaned my lower back against the counter, letting the silence hold for a few heavy seconds. I didn't give them a corporate orientation speech. I gave them a tactical briefing. Marcus believed animals can patch up the holes in our heads that we cannot see. I said, looking at each of them directly in the eye. My voice was steady, level. He also believed the men and women who bleed for this country deserve the absolute best care for the dogs and cats that keep them sane after they come home. I took a slow sip of the bitter, burnt coffee. This foundation is exactly how we execute that mission. You are not just out there treating kennel cough or wrapping broken legs. You are keeping a veteran's best friend alive. You treat every single animal that walks through those double doors like a VIP. They nodded sharply. They understood the assignment. I was not a grieving broken widow making polite morning conversation. I was a commanding officer delivering an operations order. Later that night, I sat alone in Marcus's old office. The clinic was locked down. Quiet. The streetlights outside cast long yellow shadows across his heavy oak desk. I opened the bottom right drawer. I was looking for a box of old tax folders. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer all the way out. Something caught on the metal track. I reached my hand deep into the dark, dusty gap behind the drawer. My fingers brushed against thick paper. I pulled it out. A plain white envelope. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. My name was scrawled across the front in blue ink. Marcus's handwriting. My chest tightened. A dull ache hit the back of my throat. I broke the seal. Inside was a single index card. He did not write a long, drawn-out essay. He knew I didn't need one. He wrote this the same night he drafted the war plan in our kitchen. Molly, my soldier, the card read, I know you won. I know you held the line against them. But surviving an ambush is not the end of the mission. It is just the start of the next one. I ran my calloused thumb over the dried blue ink. Do not spend the rest of your life guarding a wall. Live a full life. For me and for you. Turn our fortress into a lighthouse. My love is your permanent backup. Now go. The next morning, the Charleston air was cold. The heavy summer humidity had finally broken, leaving behind a sharp, biting chill. I stood on the front porch of my house, the exact same porch where Gerald and Timothy had tried to strip my life down to the studs. I wore my gray Army physical training uniform, black running shoes. My hair was pulled back tight. I looked at the massive oak trees lining the quiet street. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting the wet asphalt in sharp streaks of orange and gold. The house behind me was dead quiet. But it did not feel empty. It did not feel like a defensive bunker surrounded by hostiles anymore. The war was officially over. The enemy had retreated permanently broken and disgraced. I took a deep breath of the cold morning air. I stretched my arms, feeling the tight muscles in my shoulders pull and release. I stepped off the wooden porch and let my boots hit the concrete. I started to run. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening today, and I will see you next time.